So in this video, we're going to talk about the poetry of Connie Fife, whose work I'm reading out of Native Poetry in Canada. So Fife, a lot of her work revolves around explorations of suffering, which is a pretty pervasive topic in Indigenous literature, First Nations, Native American, Inuit, and Métis literature, largely because much of the experience of Indigenous people under settler colonialism and capitalism has revolved around suffering. And for Indigenous women in particular, there's an added dimension of substantially higher rates of murder, disappearance, sexual violence, domestic abuse than there is for the general population in Canada or the United States. So, yeah, suffering is just a daily facet of existence for many Indigenous people. Obviously not all Indigenous people, but it's a pervasive enough cultural norm that that a lot of Indigenous people write about it, and Fife is in this camp. She is a Cree poet from, I want to say, Saskatchewan. Yes. So she's a Cree poet, brought up actually sort of in the Anglican Church, according to the introduction in Native Poetry in Canada, because her father was an Anglican minister. And as part of that, while she initially grew up in Canada, she then subsequently lived in England and Fiji with her father doing missionary work. And so there is, again, that, so there's this sort of element of a very sophisticated literary approach, very, very rooted in sort of traditional literary techniques, but also experimenting with those traditional literary techniques to challenge the sort of limitations of traditional British or English literary styles, but there's also an internationalist component, as you often see with poets who have lived in multiple countries. Those are sort of some of the key elements that I see in Fife's poetry, at least as collected here. So, the first poem that I'm going to read you is very much about racism, violence, the suffering of Indigenous people under settler colonialism, just by virtue of being Indigenous, and the suffering of women, and especially LGBT women, in a patriarchal and heteronormative, cisnormative society. So this poem is called Ronnie, Because They Never Told You Why. 28 years old, at an age where to be told is to understand, yet on this dark night you are locked in a vice grip of racism, condemned by a court system that leaves rooms taking its small barred cells to the streets where white men prowl like starving dogs. Not finding a guilty party, they settle for the innocent. Stopped, you question their investigation and receive only their special looks saved for Indians who believe we never lost the war of the West, that they are sure they are still fighting until our total annihilation. Not one of us is above suspicion. This time it is you who is taken to their station and enclosed behind steel, obstructions released early the following day. You are finally entitled to knowledge of your crime. You are guilty of being a brown, Indian, lesbian woman. You are criminal in your nature because you do not believe in your guilt like they do, will sign no confession, instead swearing to fight back against a system that wishes for your silence and eventual death. though as long as you do die, they will allow you to scream. You dare to walk down sidewalks of cold concrete, alone deep into the night, in the belief that you are entitled to be anywhere on this continent, left to you by your grandmothers and grandfathers. Worse than this attitude, you travel where and when you want. Your skin is not white, and you say you are proud to be Indian, prouder still of your love for women, so you carry your head raised always to the sun. Back straight, you break all laws by not lowering your eyes to the stares of white people, by not cowering in dark corners meant for rats and alcoholics, safe in their drunken stupors. You are charged with 2 counts of assault and 1 of robbery, but not until you have been hurled against the police car, handcuffed, while they try to steal your dignity. Still you say you will fight back. So I quite like this poem. Again, it explores these issues of racism, sexism, homophobia, and the ways in which those elements of identity become encoded as criminal offenses, as Fife would put it here. They become encoded as criminal offenses in systems built on Eurocentrism, settler colonial white supremacy, patriarchy, and patriarchal entitlement to women's bodies, cisgendered heteronormativity, and the disciplining of queer bodies, etc., right? So all of these things, but as much as that is sort of the foreground of the poem on some level, right? It is the driving force of the conflict. The character of the poem, Ronnie, also maintains resistance, right? And this is absolutely fundamental. It's absolutely true of Indigenous communities, not obviously across the board, not necessarily always with any of these groups, but the ongoing fight for Indigenous rights in North America and elsewhere, the ongoing fight for women's rights, the ongoing fight for LGBT rights, etc., right? All of these things, these fights, for these liberatory fights continue because the people who are oppressed and repressed within these systems of power and privilege refuse to give in and refuse to agree that their very existence is somehow a criminal offense to a system designed to oppress them. And so, again, we have that sort of great liberatory ethos here. You also have in Fife's poetry I would say a broader concern with questions of suffering, but in some ways it's not a broader concern necessarily. If we think about that poem I just read as being interested in issues of LGBT rights, the next one that I'm going to read you is very much in that same vein. It's called Dear Walt, obviously addressed to Walt Whitman, one of the most famous gay poets in history, but also a white man in a patriarchal, racist society. He was a white male. He was a celebrity. He was an American. He was in many ways quite a privileged figure, right? He had a number of identity characteristics that gave him social power, but he was also gay. And it's not necessarily, I'm not a Whitman scholar. I don't know for sure at the time how many people knew he was gay. But he is now regarded as a queer icon, as well he should be, I think. But again, this is one of those things where Fife's sympathy is not, or poetic sympathy at least, is not necessarily limited by things like race, gender, borders, etc., etc. But in this case, the kinship, I think, between the poet persona and Walt Whitman is rooted in that experience of being part of a minoritized identity and a stigmatized identity. So this is Dear Walt. It must have been difficult to be caught in the grip of strong-willed metaphors who dictated that you live as an outsider in a country you so wanted to breathe into. Dear Walt, I imagine you actually believed that poetry can make a democracy smeared with the blood of others into some kind of beauty. Now you have become the dust you wrote about us being, so little has changed. We who are poets still believe we shift hearts while speaking through the voice of stone and water. Not even paralysis drove your spirit away, nor the illness of a brother in a world without compassion. Dear Walt, is it ever possible to escape metaphor or change a democracy whose foundation digs into the bones of her original people? I would like to know, Walt, if there is a place for dead poets where we can lie among leaves of grass and laugh at how little has changed. So, I mean, definitely there is the sort of element of limitations of identity here, right? The struggles of people who are oppressed within their sociocultural situation. But I think what Fife does that's so interesting here is that becomes, that along with the ambitions, idealisms of the writer, becomes a foundation for kinship with Whitman. But it is a kinship that asks him to challenge his own ideals, right? Because Whitman was in some ways the great American poet. I think in some ways he was one of those poets who, as well as anyone else, if not better, and usually better than most people, articulated sort of a dream or an ambition of what America means as an idealized concept, of course, divorced from the everyday reality of America, which is, as Fife quite rightly points out, built on the genocide of Indigenous people. And she doesn't explicitly say this, but it's implicit as well, built on the enslavement of Africans, built on systems of racism, of xenophobia, of opposition to non-Protestants, of all of this stuff, right? But at the same time, with these tides of liberatory and equitable sentiment baked into the core of the American experiment, and which periodically revives, right? Walt Whitman was a great admirer of Abraham Lincoln, who, for all his many, many faults, did re-articulate the ideals of the American founding, of liberty, of equity, of individual freedom, of the possibility of making a life for oneself, which, in my rather cynical view, the United States has more often than not failed to live up to. But I think I hope and think that we are moving into a phase where the majority of the American people start to say the ideals of the founding are worth more than the Christian nationalist fever dreams of autocratic fascists and their goons. I hope we're getting there. So I think this is. I think this is a really. She's an interesting poet. I really like Fife. I think she again explores these sort of issues of suffering, whether that is sort of direct physical, sexual violence, whatever it is, or whether that is a sort of emotional violence of having one's ideals crushed. Having the country that one loves not live up to the ideals that it has stated it is dedicated to, these kinds of things. Feeling like an outsider in one's own country, feeling the experience of being an oppressed minority, etc., etc. I think she articulates these things really, really beautifully.